Hello, everybody watching on Facebook Live. My name is Dustin Thompson. I'm with the Delaware Sierra Club. Today, I am here with Jacob Ross from Oceana. Jacob, why don't you start out by telling us a little bit about yourself and Oceana?
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dustin, and the Sierra Club for inviting me to speak. And thank you to all the participants who are joining the call. I'm really inspired by folks like yourselves who are accomplishing so much, even in spite of our current difficulties. So thanks for joining. Um, so I began work in this field by volunteering as a congressional liaison with Citizens Climate Lobby in Tampa, Florida. I then moved to Tallahassee to study economics at Florida State University. When I was there, I worked as the Associate Director of Campaigns for Rethink Energy Florida, where I did online and offline organizing to ban fracking in Florida. Then I worked as a field organizer on an electoral campaign before coming to DC to organize in the Mid-Atlantic as part of Oceana's East Coast field team. Being from Florida, I remember the confusion and the anxiety that was created by the BP oil spill, and that is something that still motivates me today. So very happy to be here.
Thank you very much for all your work and all that Oceana has done and continues to do. So just to kind of jump right in, I know we have some graphics that we're going to share kind of throughout the presentation today, but just to clear things up, I think is helpful. Delaware already passed a ban on offshore drilling off the coast of our state. So can you tell us a little bit about why this is still a risk? I'm gonna go ahead and bring up our first image here.
Yeah, I guess I'll wait for that image to come up.
There you go.
Great, thank you, Dustin. Let's see here. So yes, in 2019, Delaware passed SB 200, which bans offshore drilling in Delaware state waters and prevents the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control from issuing permits for the development of offshore drilling infrastructure that originates either in state waters or in federal waters. So yes, Delaware has taken strong action to oppose offshore drilling. In fact, that kind of bill is about the best state bill that you can possibly pass, in my opinion. Well, I'll say this, only 3 coastal states in the US have failed to pass or introduce a similar law. So you've got 15 out of 18 coastal states making some kind of statewide, opposition to offshore drilling known. Unfortunately, President Trump continues to aggressively pursue offshore drilling in the Atlantic's federal waters, including the federal waters that are directly adjacent to Delaware, which cannot be protected through state law. Further, I would say a spill anywhere in the Atlantic could affect the entire Atlantic. The only way really that we can eliminate the risk of an oil spill devastating Delaware's economy is to advocate for the removal of the entire Atlantic from the 5-year plan.
So I think that's maybe a bit of information. It's really important to understand the difference between state protected versus federally available water resources.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there's only so much you can do, and the Atlantic planning areas are so large, and what we saw with the BP spill is that, a spill that happens, 200 miles offshore can make its way to shore. So just protecting state waters is really insufficient. But it is a great move, and it shows, solidarity opposing offshore drilling. But what I think folks need to focus on beyond the state ledge and the state waters is making sure that the federal waters across the Atlantic are removed from consideration.
So Obama put really tight restrictions on drilling and closed the water resources in the Atlantic for drilling purposes, correct?
So this answer is a little complicated. Under the Offshore Continental Shelf Lease Act, President Trump initiated the development of a new 5-year plan, which puts the Atlantic back on the table, even after the Obama administration removed it from their 5-year plan. And there's another wrinkle here. You might have heard of some specific restrictions that Obama put opposing offshore drilling in the Atlantic and the Arctic. Now, Obama used what we call a 12A withdrawal to institute an oil leasing ban on ecologically important areas in the Atlantic and most of the Arctic. These bans prevent oil and gas leasing in most of the Arctic Ocean off the coast of Alaska and in 31 deep sea canyons off the Atlantic coast, spanning from the Chesapeake to the Canadian border. But in April of 2017, President Trump issued Executive Order 13795, which purported to revoke Obama's 12A withdrawals. In response to Trump's purported revocations, a federal court in Alaska actually did rule that the move to overturn Obama's bans on oil and gas leasing in the Arctic and Atlantic Oceans was unlawful. So all of that to say, some might ask, does the Alaska court ruling mean that certain areas of the Atlantic cannot appear in the proposed program? And the answer to that is yes. BOEM has actually prepared for this as an option in their 5-year plan. And I think we had an image to show you all of where those protected canyons are. Yeah, here we go. So you'll notice that, even though Obama successfully withdrew these really ecologically important canyons, 31 of them, the 3 planning areas in the Atlantic still cover a huge swath of ocean. So really, given the nature of an oil spill, these canyons are not protected, again, until the entire Atlantic is removed from the 5-year plan. So that is to say, yes, Obama did take some steps to protect the Atlantic, but much, much more still needs to be done.
So just so everybody that's watching, these blue, I'm not sure if my highlight will come through or not, but these blue kind of lines throughout here are the canyons that you're talking about.
Right. Yeah. So
and
this
so
was, go ahead.
What's the significance of this nautical buffer, this red line here?
That's a great question. It's tough to say. I don't have an exact answer to that question. There have been versions that include a 25-mile buffer. There have been versions that include a 75-mile buffer. But oil doesn't respect state lines or any arbitrary buffers. That is really, I think, just an inadequate measure that's included in these programs to give the public some sort of sense of false security. Really, a buffer of any distance is insufficient to protect coastal communities from the fallout of an oil spill. So,
do you have to know offhand how far out the Gulf spill was from the shore?
Yeah, the BP disaster, it was at least 100 miles off. I can't remember exactly how far.
But it was devastated the entire shoreline, essentially.
Exactly. It happened off the coast of Louisiana. And when I was in Florida, I remember hearing about the oil washing up in the Panhandle in the state of Florida. So, if an oil spill were to happen in the area where there's a lot of interest, actually, off the mouth of the Chesapeake, I mean, it could be devastating for the entire mid-Atlantic region. The spawning grounds for blue crabs, there are just the ecological and economic disaster could be horrible because it could be such a large event.
So what's the kind of the realistic chance that Trump or Congress can move on this issue anytime soon? Are they close, or they still have a lot of roadblocks to get through? Where are we at in that process?
Right. So this is an excellent question. You might have heard, I think it was late last year, that the 5-year plan was indefinitely delayed. Well, in a March memorandum, Secretary Bernhardt of the Department of the Interior, which has jurisdiction over offshore oil and gas leasing in federal waters, directed department employees to continue their work, saying, quote, "Failure to work earnestly at this critical time would be disruptive to our department's important mission." So that tells us the administration is showing no signs of slowing down its work on the 5-year plan as it continues, even now, right now, to pursue an aggressive energy dominance agenda. And I think the most important thing that we can remember is that this administration is characteristically unpredictable. With that in mind, we must remember that the Department of the Interior can move forward on the 5-year plan at a moment's notice. There's nothing really stopping them like that.
So they could literally reverse course of what we've been talking about doing on statewide, and just basically saying no and just say we need energy security. This is what we're going to do.
Yes, it's so frustrating because every I'll talk about this later. Every coastal governor on the east and west coast is opposed to offshore drilling, and if you ask the department heads, if you ask Dr. Walter Cruikshank, who is the acting director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, he'll tell you that the Bureau is moving forward with the 5-year plan. They are continuing to compile it. The next iteration of that would be called the proposed program, and they're still working on it. So it's really confusing when you say this plan is indefinitely delayed, but the people who have jurisdiction over implementing these leases continue to say that work is ongoing. So we really don't know.
And we've had multiple ocean-based disasters, from oil in general, but certainly recently, offshore drilling with, recently in terms of just last year, a lot of things have happened that can maybe put things in a chronological kind of aspect. But BP was not that long ago, and there's a long history of oil destroying the ecology in the ocean. What kind of security measures are driving this conversation that the proponents are saying everything's fine, everything's safe, we can go forward?
That's an interesting question. I think it's important to focus on what we can say in response to the industry and to an administration that seems to continue to aggressively pursue this energy dominance agenda. Because I can't really speak for what exactly the proponents will say, but what I can share is some of the fundamental tenets of the economics of offshore drilling. And there are 4 things that really stick out to me. The first is that states wouldn't see significant jobs or revenue for 10 to 20 years after the initial offshore leasing period. So drilling is incredibly dirty and dangerous. And so it's not surprising that it takes decades for a well to become operational. So any economic benefit from jobs, again, 10 to 20 years. Second thing that is a problem, most of these positions on offshore drilling operations would be filled by out-of-state or international workers. Third, once the oil is gone, so are the jobs and all the revenue that came with them. And the fourth thing on this is we've seen, as we saw in Florida and we continue to see across the Gulf and across the world, is that tourism, fishing, recreation, these are industries that rely on a clean ocean and that would never fully recover from the industrialization of the coast or from a spill that would incredibly damage the environment. So I think another effective way to respond to any effort to say that offshore drilling is something we should pursue, in addition to talking about what the governor opposition, in Delaware, offshore drilling threatens 25,000 jobs and 1.2 billion in GDP in that state alone. 25,000 jobs and over $1 billion in GDP. So it's great that we do have some tools to sort of fight back and say, we know that this is a bad deal for Delaware and we shouldn't move forward with it.
So are the governors able to help push back on BOEM to kind of slow this process down, or hopefully stop it, permits in general, if they're off the coast of their states? Is that something that they can do?
So yes, well, governors can't. let me just make sure I understand your question. If a governor can actually stop, expansion in federal waters.
Maybe not stop, but push back.
Okay. Yes. Yes. Great question. Governors certainly can, and they have. If anyone's interested in seeing sort of an overview of all of the opposition in Delaware and the Atlantic, Oceana has what we call an opposition fact sheet, which essentially just details all the opposition in a particular state. And I don't know if I have anything for the governor on here, but I do know that Bethany Beach, Dewey Beach, Fenwick Island, Lewis, Milton, Rehoboth, and South Bethany all are municipalities that have passed a resolution or signed a letter in official opposition to offshore drilling. Let's see if anything on the governor here.
While you're looking for that, how is the argument for offshore drilling being impacted by the plummeting costs of oil right now? I mean, if costs are hitting such, not to pun or anything, but bottom barrel prices, what's kind of the incentive driving expanding the industry that's going to take a decade or more to get up off the ground?
Right. That's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to that. I could find out for you. But what I will say is the industry will continue to make arguments that sort of contradict some of the facts. One of the things that we know, we've heard over and over again, is that offshore drilling expansion is needed for energy security in the United States, to make sure that we have enough resources. When in 2015, we started exporting fossil fuel resources to other countries, and we are now net exporters of fossil fuel resources. So it seems to be, it's interesting. All I can say is, with all these coastal governors, with many municipalities, with the environmental community that we're all so familiar with, who is really pushing for offshore drilling to move forward? I think that's a great question for everyone to ask. It's sort of a democratic question. We see so much opposition from so many different constituencies, business constituencies, chambers of commerce, local government, ordinary people, fishermen, or huge opposition from fishermen and fishing communities. Who's really pushing this? And they're pushing it really hard. So I can't speak exactly to pricing, but I can say that the advocacy for offshore drilling doesn't really fit the facts.
So do you think that the people pushing this are going to use the argument for jobs or recovery from COVID as a way to push through? Are you seeing any of that now, or what's the kind of the feeling on the ground related to that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think what I've seen is that there are signals from Secretary Bernhardt of the Department of the Interior that they are continuing to move forward aggressively on their agenda, whatever that might be. We know that includes offshore drilling. So I can't really speak exactly to the industry's response to COVID, and it's I guess acceptance or ability to use the current public health crisis to their advantage. But what I can say is that there, like I mentioned before, is we have strong economic figures to show it that this is really a bad deal for Delaware, really a bad deal for the United States. So we're ready to respond. Oceana is ready to respond, and folks that are interested in being part of that response can reach out to me and you and try to push back against any narrative that says that offshore drilling would be good for coastal communities.
And I want to bring up, let's see if I can bring up two windows at the same time. No, I can. So I'll kind of cycle through these a little bit with the next question. So, I had asked you previously in our conversations before how these sort of open areas for offshore drilling kind of correlate with the areas available for offshore wind.
Right.
So let's see if I can't, no, let me do that. All right, so I brought back up the image that you gave us that kind of looks at the potential areas that they're looking for offshore drilling. And I'd like to also bring up the leasing areas for offshore wind as well. So a lot of these, it looks like, are in some of the same waters. So is it kind of a one or another situation? How would the two kind of reconcile if you have, you know, offshore drilling projects coming into these same areas?
Right. So this is a great question. And I don't have a super clear answer for it. I reached out to my colleagues to get some assistance in finding an answer to this. And Oceana is really, we're not experts on offshore wind. So, but we are able to find out some information. I hope what I can provide is helpful. And if not, please let me know and I will do some more digging. But as far as conflicting areas with offshore wind and offshore drilling, most of the wind projects are actually moving forward more quickly than the 5-year program, which is great. The next iteration of the 5-year program will have to accommodate the existing wind projects. And likely these areas will not be available for drilling, or will have some type of a buffer. So that's good news. You know, if these wind leases are established, a new 5-year program, whenever that comes along, would have to accommodate them. However, currently, the full span of the OCS is on the table for the Atlantic, which does directly overlap with certain offshore wind projects, as you're seeing now from Massachusetts to North Carolina. And these are all slated for federal waters. So that's problematic, that you have an offshore drilling plan that includes all lease areas in the Atlantic, when we know that there are offshore wind projects that are moving forward. That's a little suspect to me. So if oil leasing has already occurred, so this is sort of the opposite point. If oil leasing has already occurred, renewable energy leases will have to be coordinated. So that comes directly from the draft proposed plan, which is the BOEM document that outlines the offshore leasing program of the administration. So essentially what they're saying is, if offshore drilling is there first, we're going to have to coordinate. There's going to have to be some kind of negotiation to happen. But based on everything that we're seeing right now, these programs are moving forward more quickly, and it would be likely that in the future these areas will not be available to offshore drilling.
I think it's interesting to note, as we're kind of wrapping up here, the scale of these offshore. I brought this map back up that you provided from BOEM with the 5-year draft proposed program areas highlighted. Just the size of the swaths of ocean that is available for offshore drilling. And then I'm going to bring back up just the quick shot of the offshore wind areas available versus the size of the offshore wind areas that are available. I mean, the availability for offshore drilling, which has had devastating consequences in the Gulf and in other areas, are massive compared to these tiny slivers of ocean available for wind. I thought that was an interesting thing as I was looking at these two documents here.
Of course, yeah, and I think it's, we know that offshore wind produces more jobs than offshore drilling for sure. So it is interesting. I hope that if I can sort of close with this closing remark that I wanted to leave you all with. Let's see here. Yeah, so the president, like I said, could move forward with the 5-year offshore drilling plan at a moment's notice. And right now, as we were looking at, 100% of the Atlantic planning areas are on the table. to be leased for offshore drilling. When the federal government opens up public comment again, Oceana wants to work with people across the state to submit official comments to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management in opposition to offshore drilling. So without continued attention, I think, from the scientific community, from the conservation community, the business community, Delaware could be subject to the economic and environmental losses of coastal industrialization. So if we want to make sure that priorities are in line, if offshore wind is important to you and stopping offshore drilling is important to you, we have to be prepared to participate in the public comment process. And so if anyone's interested in doing that, my email is j, as in Jacob Ross, at oceana.org, oceana.org. You can also find us on Facebook. We're Oceana Mid-Atlantic, and hopefully we can work together to continue providing public comment in opposition to this dirty and dangerous process.
So if people want to get involved, they can just fire you up an email and you can get them plugged in.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm looking forward to it. There's so much possibility out in Delaware. But yeah, send me an email, jross@oceana.org, or you can send us a message on Facebook, Oceana Mid-Atlantic.
Great, wonderful. Well, I just want to thank you very much for reaching out to the Sierra Club and bringing this important issue into the conversation today and doing this live stream. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. So everybody watching, if you just joined, this will be up on our webpage by tomorrow. So it's sierraclub.org/Delaware. And then under the outings tab, the live stream series has its own page, and you can watch all of our old episodes, and you'll be able to view this one again tomorrow. So again, thank you very much for tuning in. Jacob, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.